In the previous video, we discussed the most common sustainable development models used by professionals and experts. However, despite the logical validity of these models, they do not provide clear answers to important questions such as: how do we finance all plans to improve the quality of life? How do we monetize the returns on social projects and institutional developments? Do we need to halt the extraction of minerals and fossil fuels or the harvesting of timber for consumer products, thus cutting their tangible returns for the sake of achieving environmentally sustainable development goals? None of the models that we discussed so far provide answers directly to address these inquiries. But don't worry, this doesn't mean that we have exhausted all the possibilities for finding answers, and the capital stock model can be one of these answers. So, what is it and how can we implement it? In 1994, a study group of the World Bank led by Ismail Sirajuddin developed the so-called capital stock model, with the basic idea being: if we live only of the interest and not the capital, the basis of prosperity is maintained. However, if we consume the substance, our means of existence is endangered in the long term. This group also developed the formula of the capital stock model, which looks like this. The value and revolutionary nature of this model make it important to dedicate a full video to breaking it down and explaining it in the simplest way possible. So let's begin by understanding the concept of capital in economics. Capital refers to assets and resources used to start, run, or grow a business, create value, and generate income. Therefore, any substance that can be transformed into value is considered capital from the economist's perspective. What is stock then? Stock is the total amount of assets and resources that is identified at a specific point of time. It can be seen, according to Goodwin, as the opposite of a flow, which is measured over a certain period of time. I particularly appreciate the example provided by Goodwin in his article, 5 Kinds of Capital, Useful Concepts for Sustainable Development, where he compares flow to a movie, with assets and resources being transformed into value that is partially returned to add up to the assets and increase the overall value. But in contrast, stock is like a snapshot taken at a single moment where all substances are considered stock regardless of their category, as long as they have the potential for value. Now, let's combine these two terms and define capital stock as the total amount of substances available at a given time that have the potential to create or be of value and drive long-term growth. Now, let's focus on the concept of capital in traditional economics. For over 2 centuries, economists have emphasized that it was the produced capital that determined the productivity of a system. The amount of consumer products, machines, technology, buildings, harvests, livestock, precious metals, minerals, cash, and energy resources produced by an economy serves as an indicator of its health. Early economists defined the wealth of a nation in terms of 3 categories: land, labor, and capital. However, it is important to note the following. First, the term land could refer to any part of natural capital, but while land was seen as limited resource, the rest of nature was assumed to be limitless and often taken for granted. For example, while agricultural land was considered a valuable asset, water, trees, and other natural resources were viewed as gifts from Mother Nature. Second, according to the economic theories of the time, the reference to labor was not seen as equal to humans. While this may seem inhumane, it was unfortunately the reality. Labor referred only to those humans who could convert capital into something of value for a certain wage, essentially meaning personal hours of paid work. And in such system, the only justified expenses towards labor, aside from wages, were those necessary for teaching workers how to be productive or keeping them physically fit for their job. Access to good education, healthcare, and social security was only available if one could afford to pay for it, because such expenses would be perceived by the traditional economist as liabilities that are not balanced by more productive assets. Now, let's analyze how capital stock model totally reformed this understanding. The World Bank's capital stock model has introduced new categorization of capital: natural, produced, human, and social. So let's discuss each of them. Natural capital as a concept is not new and was tackled by early economists, but it was previously viewed from a largely homocentric perspective. This resulted in only those aspects of nature that were being used by humans, particularly those that were being depleted, being labeled as natural capital. However, the capital stock model takes a different approach, recognizing that the depletion of one aspect of nature, such as fertile topsoil, cannot be separated from the depletion of the forest that grows on it, and also depleted in the process of converting it to value like timber. This model also acknowledges that minerals, including oil, are also considered as natural capital, as they are depleted in the process of creating value. And finally, can you imagine the air we breathe without oxygen, or with extremely higher concentration of toxic particles, only because the clean air was used as free and endless input in the value creation process? Because if not, then isn't it valuable resource, thus depletable natural capital? Realizing the importance of the natural environment in sustaining human economies has led to a growing awareness of the delicate balance between the two, resulting in natural environment being perceived as precious natural capital in this model. And as a result, the wealth of nation should now be measured not only by the produced capital, but also by the used and preserved components of its natural resources. As you may have noticed, there is no longer a labor capital category in this model. It has been replaced with human and social capital. And if you think this change has little impact, allow me to explain the full potential of this new approach. A human capital refers to an individual's potential to produce something that is economically desirable. Unlike traditional theory that all what is calculated is the labor force, capital stock model invites us to view humans as a stock of capability, making each individual a form of capital that can generate a flow of services. And this is a major shift from the way we used to learn traditional economics. And it has the power to reshape the way we build our strategies. And here is why. The human capital, as we mentioned, is a pool of capabilities that can be released to create value at any time. And these capabilities depend not only on the knowledge, education, training, and skills. They also include useful behavioral habits, as well as the level of energy, physical, and mental health. Such an approach simply means that providing high quality of life is no longer seen as an act of charity or goodwill, but rather an investment in enabling one of the capital stock categories to produce value. Does it make sense? Now, let's move to social capital, which is a complex concept that is difficult to define and even harder to measure. In modern industrialized economies, it refers to the trust, mutual understanding, shared values, and socially held knowledge that facilitate the coordination of economic activity. In other words, it is about how the economic actors interact and organize themselves to generate growth and development. Economists have only recently recognized the importance of social capital and have found that differences in social capital between communities and societies can help explain the variations in economic development. And as a result, the focus of institutions has been revived recently to the new institutional economics literature. To better understand the significance of social capital, consider the following scenario. Two communities are hit by a climate anomaly that damages their infrastructure and halts industrial and commercial activities. Both communities have limited access to centralized administrative resources and must wait for more to arrive. In response, both communities' leaders call on members to mobilize and expedite the recovery process. Which community do you think will mobilize faster and in a coordinated manner to restore economic activity and return to normal life? Well, it is likely the community with more social capital, which can be converted into value when needed. And this example highlights the importance of inclusion, participation, and the promotion of an enabling environment in building social capital. And only competent administrations can understand and prioritize these elements to create social capital that can bring prosperity. Having this said, you must have understood by now the vital role of the capable administration that can build the social capital and release it in the form of tangible value when required. And lastly, produced capital is the one that is mostly referred to in the old economics textbooks, where we may find only two kinds of such capital: financial and physical. And the discussions of physical capital would all have been about things made by human beings, alongside with the limited part of natural capital. Thus, physical assets that are generated by applying human productive activities to natural capital that are used to provide a flow of goods and services are called produced capital. Let's look at the capital stock model formula again. What if a nation decided to go rational and follow the mathematical logic of the capital stock formula, where one form of capital can be substituted for another? For example, to rely on converting natural and environmental capital into produced or economic capital, because it sums up just as compliant as developing a system that chooses to preserve the natural resources and considers focusing on its social with less emphasis on the economic capital. Well, it is important to remember that neglecting any aspect of the sustainability prism will ultimately lead to the failure of the sustainable development strategy, as in the previous video. And please follow this link to watch that video if you haven't. Therefore, all components of the capital stock must be taken into account. Additionally, it is crucial to leave future generations with more opportunities and options to adhere to the principles of sustainable development. And ignoring natural capital, for example, will result in its degradation and depletion, leaving no hope for future generations. And lastly, voices in the scientific community advocate for a conditional capital stock model, where environmental and social capital are preserved at an untouchable minimum. The environmental and social capital, according to these voices, are often referred to as the moral capital, and it is argued that significant efforts must be made to regenerate them if they decline. So far, we have discussed all the components of the capital stock model. We now have a better understanding of all types of capital and can clearly identify the difference between traditional economics and the capital stock model. The only remaining aspect is understanding Siraj ad-Din's statement about living off the interest and not the capital, and not consuming the substance. How can this be implemented from a sustainable development perspective? Let's revisit our neighborhood example from the previous video, and please follow the link to watch it if you haven't. What if the father, who is the original owner of the house, decided to rent it out instead of allowing his son to move in and make it his own home? What if the son never cared actually about the condition of the house as long as the rent was paid? In this scenario, it is likely that over time, the house will become less desirable for potential tenants and will require significant funds to restore it to a livable condition. This is the resemblance of consuming the capital stock of the economy by exploiting the produced assets rather than maintaining them to live off their dividends received from the rental payments. Now, let's consider a scenario where the tenants in the neighborhood do not care about maintaining the green area or keeping the surroundings clean, leading to the presence of insects and rodents and polluting the air. This is similar to consuming the capital stock of the environment. And to reverse these negative effects, a significant amount of resources and efforts will be needed, meaning that the son's actions in this scenario have led to the degradation of the environment, leaving the next generation with fewer opportunities. Another scenario to consider is if other homeowners in the neighborhood also decided to rent their properties and neglect the maintenance and landscaping. At the same time, the temporary tenants do not care about building a sense of community because they have no intention to stay long term. This results in a neighborhood of indifference and potentially increased violence and hate. It is unlikely that such neighborhood would be able to mobilize and deal with challenges like natural disasters and pandemics. It also becomes unattractive to investors or potential buyers, leading to the loss of the capital stock of society and the destruction of social institutions that were built by previous generations. Can you imagine what such a neighborhood would end up looking like? In Siraj ad-Din's language, the next generation of homeowners in the neighborhood decided to exploit the available capital and consume the available resources without investing, which led to the depletion of all types of capital instead of using them to generate dividends while maintaining their value, if not increasing it.